but it's an informational presentation, is my understanding. Right? There's no vote to be had tonight.
Yep. Hi, Ariel.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, Ariel.
Hello.
Karen.
Hi, Karen.
How are you?
So I'm ready to get started if everybody else is. I don't have much to go on other than what everybody has seen in terms of what our agenda is, which is HPD presenting on the housing portion of the neighborhood plan, and then there's a discussion about the IBZ vision plan. So do you have a preference which one goes first? That was directed at DCP and
You're asking me?
whoever. I don't have the agenda right in front of me, so I don't know if there's a.
Well, I know we're prepared for those two presentations. I had always envisioned HPD going first and us in the IBZ going second, but if we're nothing else, we are pretty flexible. So you let us know what you want and we'll be there and do it and take questions. So.
That is fine. I think we can get started.
And I really like that zoning change map behind you. So
Oh, yeah.
it's a great thing to look at. Yeah.
It's a complicated thing to look at, I have to say.
So should I get started, or Jonathan, was there anything you wanted to say before I dive in?
Yeah, I was actually waiting for the go ahead from Ariel. Was that the go ahead?
Oh yes, that was my go ahead. Sorry, I wasn't more specific about that.
No, wonderful. Yeah, no, I mean, I'll be brief because we have a lot to get to. I just say we're extremely excited to be here. Finally, we were hoping to be here a long time ago, but good things sometimes you have to wait for. And we're here with our colleagues from HPD, who will give a presentation on affordable housing and mandatory inclusionary housing, and within the context of Gowanus. And so I'm here with Michael Sandler, who will be giving that presentation. I'm also here with my colleagues from City Planning, Jonah Rogoff and Amy Jin and Alex Summer. We'll be presenting on the recently released today IBZ vision plan, and we'll also take your questions. And we'll also be here to take your questions on outside of those two topics. I'm sure people may have questions outside of those. I mean, there's upcoming meetings that will be able to handle all sorts of questions. So, you know, if you can wait, that would be great, and focus your questions on the topics of the night, but we'll also be able to field whatever you throw at us. And yeah, with that, I'll just hand it over to Michael.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. And actually, could whoever is the host of the meeting enable screen sharing? I'm currently not able to.
Yep, no problem.
And so while we kind of get that set, I'll introduce myself. My name is Michael Sandler. I'm an assistant commissioner in the Office of Neighborhood Strategies at HPD. Joined by a few colleagues tonight. I'll be giving half of the presentation, and I'll be splitting it with Uriah Johnston from our neighborhood planning team. And we're also joined by Lynn Zhang and Aaron Buchanan from our Brooklyn planning team. And to the extent that any questions come up, we also have Aaron Kaufman from the Gowanus Green Development team here. But the focus tonight will be on generally our city's affordable housing crises, what affordable housing is and what we mean when we say affordable housing, and how does MIH work is the main kind of focus of tonight's presentation. And let me see, and I am now able to share my screen, which is great. So I'm going to begin sharing now. Folks should be able to see the slide, our beautiful cover slide. Holler if that is not the case. So our agenda for tonight's presentation, we'll talk about New York City's housing crises. I'm going to then pass it to Uriah to talk about what is affordable housing and current conditions in the Gowanus area. And then I'll take it back to kind of wrap up with our city housing strategies that address the city's underlying housing crises. So first, I think just to kind of frame out the situation that our city is currently in, I think people often talk about the city's housing crisis, but we actually have a number of distinct and overlapping crises that are kind of all happening together. And I'm going to go through kind of 5 individual crises that we've identified, but there are also others. And so I'm going to go through these really quickly, and then I'll give a little bit more detail about a few of these as we go through. So first, just New Yorkers have low incomes. Families with the lowest incomes really cannot afford the rents that support the cost of operating a building. This is a fundamental mismatch between the cost of operating a building in New York and what New Yorkers are actually able to pay for in rent. And preventing homelessness and ensuring that New Yorkers live in safe and high quality housing really requires subsidizing housing for low income families and individuals. So we have this sort of crisis around low income housing. We also have limited supply. In the last 20 years, the New York City region has added about 150,000 more jobs than it's added housing units. And this shortage really means that we're all competing for the few available prices, competing for the few available apartments that do exist, driving up prices. I think anyone who's really gone in a housing search in the last 10 years has experienced this with showing up for an open house with seeing 30 other people, or putting your application in, right after seeing that apartment, and it's already gone. I think everyone has kind of seen what this intense competition for housing means in the housing search. I think especially anyone who's looked for housing in Community Board 6, where I think there's really intense demand for housing. And what this means is that even moderate income households have difficulty finding housing that's affordable for their households. And then at the same time as this, we have segregated and unequal neighborhoods. New York City is the most diverse city in the United States, but discrimination and segregation in our neighborhoods persists. New York City's neighborhoods are segregated, and that segregation is rooted in our history of racist laws, policies, and practice, and intentionally enacted and able to create segregated neighborhoods and prevent certain people from living in certain places. And there are really clear connections between a New Yorker's race, where they live, and their access to opportunity. And so that's something that really needs to be tackled as its own distinct crisis. And then we have a crisis of homelessness. Each night, there are nearly 60,000 people sleeping in the city's shelter system, including a very significant number of children. And the high cost of housing is really the primary cause of homelessness in New York City. I think folks that have been following the mayoral debate or other things might think about mental illness and homelessness as a key thing, but really I think it's important to understand that the vast majority of homeless in New York are not suffering from mental illness and are suffering from a housing crisis. And finally, I think especially in the Gowanus area, important to remember that we have a crisis of underinvestment in public housing. Nycha supplies 8% of New York City's rental housing stock. In the Gowanus area, it's even a greater percentage of the rental housing stock. It's about 11% of all units in Community Board 6. So of the rental apartments, it's an even greater portion. Nycha, though it's only 8% of New York City's rental housing stock, it comprises 80% of the apartments in New York City with rents that are less than $500 a month. It's a critical resource for New Yorkers. And for decades, federal housing subsidies have favored middle-class home ownership over public housing, leaving Nycha with $40 billion in capital repair needs. And this is a real crisis facing our city and community. So just a little bit more on that first crisis I mentioned. So 1 in 4 households in New York City earn less than less than $30,000. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what does an affordable rent mean for different households in a bit. But just for now, I'll say that households that earn less than $30,000 really cannot afford rent that's any more than $600 a month and not be rent burdened. The average cost to operate an apartment in New York City is over $1,000 per month. And that's just the hard cost of operating a housing. That's labor, utilities, fuel, insurance, maintenance. This does not include debt service or a loan to pay back the cost of purchasing that housing. It's just like the cost of operating it. And so, as I kind of mentioned before, preventing severe rent burden, homelessness, unsafe housing requires subsidy to make up the difference. That it really requires the government stepping in to ensure that New Yorkers have quality and safe apartments. Talk a little bit more about rent burden. So around 30% of New Yorkers spend more than half of their income on rent. You see that on the lower end of the income spectrum, this is even more acute. So 40% of 40% of low income New York City households spend more than half of their income on rent. And So you'll notice just the bottom bar, this is folks that earn less than 30% of the area median income. We're going to talk more about what that means in a little bit. Over half of households in this category are severely rent burdened, meaning they spend more than half of their income on rent. I will note, though, that on this kind of the second bar from the left, the low income households, this population makes up the highest portion of rent burdened New Yorkers. Both a higher share of low income New Yorkers are rent burdened than any of the other categories, and a greater number. So I think folks talk about the need for those with the most extreme lowest income, but there's also a very acute need for folks that are in this low income category, between $28,000 a year and $75,000 a year in terms of household income. Part of this this issue has to do with insufficient housing production. This chart shows housing production by decade, and you can see that over the last 20, 30 years, housing production has really lagged what we were doing in previous decades. I think New Yorkers, experience, especially folks that live in the Gowanus area, you see cranes all over downtown Brooklyn. You see so much housing construction that it's easy to think that New York is going through a building boom, but that is really not accurate. If you actually compare us to peer cities, New York City is producing much less housing per capita than other cities, including other cities that we think of as having a housing crisis as well. And part of this kind of mismatch between seeing all those cranes, but also knowing that we actually have very low housing production compared to the size of our city, has to do with how concentrated our housing production is. So this map is showing housing production in the 2010s. So this is from 2010 to 2020, housing production per acre. So you see real different patterns across neighborhood, and you see that housing production is really born unequally by different neighborhoods. You've seen significant growth in housing in formerly non-residential areas rezoned to allow for housing. So that's really the story of downtown Brooklyn or the North Brooklyn Waterfront. But at the same time, you see a net loss of housing in certain areas, especially historic districts. And in the area around the Gowanus rezoning, you've actually seen in the last decade a loss in the amount of housing in parts of Park Slope, Forum Hill, Cobble Hill, and Brooklyn Heights. And so you see, and then you also see huge parts of the city with kind of no net change in housing over the last decade. Including if you kind of zoom into the study area and the Gowanus rezoning area, much of that rezoning area applies. This map is showing just affordable housing new construction, and we'll talk about in a little bit about what affordable housing means, but a range of factors influence where new affordable housing is constructed. Nearly 50,000 new affordable homes were created, and an additional 110,000 were preserved as a result of the Housing New York Plan since 2014. But that affordable housing construction has been very concentrated. You see that in areas of the South Bronx, East Harlem, Midtown West, Hunters Point South, Greenpoint, and East New York. And you see very little in Brooklyn Community Board 6 and the Gowanus area. Basically, you just see one census tract lighting up here, basically because of the Lightstone development. And just a little bit more on the challenges confronting New York City's public housing. So Nycha's aging infrastructure has been underfunded by the federal government for decades. Its 175,000 apartments now confront $40 billion in major capital needs, a figure that grows by about $1 billion each year. Most Nycha buildings are old. They're 50 to 80 years old and have gone many years without upgrades or investments. And Nycha only receives about $500 million in annual capital funding. Really a very small fraction of what we need. And at the same time of this, Nycha's organization is not designed to meet the current operational and capacity delivery challenges, and residents face unprecedented health and economic crises. So this is just kind of the existing conditions. We'll talk a little bit about the city, what the city's doing for Nycha, but I think we'll leave a larger discussion of Nycha for a future meeting. I'm not a Nycha expert. I work at the HPD. And then just a little bit about kind of what's changed since COVID. Obviously, our world has changed significantly in the last year. I really want to caution, I think you've seen a lot in the news about things like vacancy rates being incredibly high, or significant changes to the housing market. Really want to caution that changes to New York City's housing market and our needs as a result of COVID are really going to take time to play out and understand. One thing we do know is New Yorkers could not afford housing costs before the pandemic, and now many have lost their jobs or a portion of income. Over 1 million New York City residents have filed for unemployment in the last year. And so, while it is going to take time to kind of understand the changes to our city, as we plan, it's really important to consider both those immediate needs and kind of what's going on with COVID, but also a long-term framework for equitable housing development. Markets take time to evolve and respond to new zoning, and new zoning, like we're discussing now, is really designed to be in place for decades. It's not a short-term response to a crisis. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Uriah Johnson, who's going to talk about what is affordable housing, what is this term, and what do we mean when we say that?
Thank you, Michael. So to start, I'm just going to give a simple definition of what we mean when we say affordable housing. So housing is considered affordable when a family or a household spends no more than a third of its income on rent and utilities. So we have some general examples of different incomes and roughly how much they might need to pay in rent to make it affordable. So before we go in more about how HPD achieves affordable housing, it's important to know that there are several different types of affordable housing. They're determined based on government regulation and regulated to determine how to keep the homes affordable. So beginning with no regulation or unregulated private market housing, this would be housing that is just naturally occurring or is affordable to only certain families. And then there is public housing, which Michael talked a little bit more about. But for a general definition, this is housing that's regulated by the federal government and a local housing authority, which of course for New York City is Nycha. And these entities ensure that all households meet an income eligibility and rents are priced to ensure that each family is only paying a third of their income to make it affordable. For rent stabilized and rent controlled housing, these are units that were built before 1974 and are regulated by New York State. So these units are regulated through small incremental increases to lease renewals for current tenants. And then for new tenants or folks, when an apartment is turned over, the rental increases are capped to make sure that it remains affordable in perpetuity. And then there's government assisted housing. So these are privately owned buildings that receive public subsidy in exchange for income restricted housing for affordable rents. And this includes the housing that will be generated as a result of mandatory inclusionary housing and Gowanus Green, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation. Then lastly, there is rental assistance. So this is affordable housing that's made affordable through rental vouchers and other forms of assistance. And that supplementary income is provided through the federal government, state, and city programs to pay for all or part of the rental costs on behalf of a tenant. So the eligibility for various types of affordable housing are determined by a household's area median income. And this number is determined each year by the federal government for different regions. This year, the AMI for a 3-family household in the New York City metro area is just over $107,000. So HPD uses this number as a benchmark to understand how best to finance affordable housing for New Yorkers with AMIs from 0% to 120% AMI. And we see here, we have a couple of different examples of roughly how much a family or a household makeup would make under these various different AMIs. And to go a little bit deeper about how much a family roughly would pay under HPD rent versus private market naturally occurring housing in the Gowanus and CD6 area, we see that for a studio under HPD rent, there would be, for seniors, the rent would be priced at about 30% of their income, or just as little as $419. But looking at the private market, naturally occurring housing in this area could cost as much as $2,000 for a studio apartment, and so on and so forth. So we see with HPD finance, affordable housing would make a significant difference in what could be affordable for folks that are earning less to be for this area to be accessible to them. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the neighborhood conditions and let you know exactly, a little bit more about who is able to live in this neighborhood, but also a little more about who isn't. So first up with household income distribution. In CD6, we see that there is a high concentration of families with middle incomes and significant more than what's on average for the rest of the city. And we see that there are also folks that have extremely low to moderate incomes, but those folks are in some, at least for extremely low income, are not as much as in other areas in the city, and may have difficulties finding housing compared to some of their neighbors who are higher earners. And then when we see the breakdown of rentals versus ownership, we see there's slightly less home ownership or rentals, renters in the district. And so that could mean that there's just a lot less opportunity for rental opportunities in the CD6 area. Next slide, please. And then looking at rent burden, there's significantly less rent burden in CD6 as compared to Brooklyn and in New York City, with 56% of folks not being rent burdened at all, as opposed to 44% who are either rent burdened or severely rent burdened, meaning they pay more than half of their income on rents and utilities. And it's difficult to understand, or it's difficult for those folks who are severely rent burdened to find additional opportunities in this area specifically. And then looking in terms of the housing types, the types of affordable housing, like I previously spoke of, that there's majority of the housing here is not government assisted housing, having about 9% that is Nycha housing, and then just 3% that is government assisted housing. So that's again, the privately owned, rent regulated, rent restricted, income restricted housing that's available to keep housing affordable for various amounts of incomes. And then for rent stabilization, we also see that within that rent stabilized or rental housing, the vast majority of it is not rent stabilized housing. And that makes it challenging for folks to know how they can exactly ensure that housing remains affordable for them. So in looking at rent over time, we see in CD6, in the last 10 years, there's been sharp increases in the average asking rents in the area. It's 36% to be exact, which is significantly higher than the city and Brooklyn overall. But we also know that, with these sharp increases, that means that there could be an increase in demand and making this area, again, not as affordable to as many people as could be possible through, proactively providing affordable housing in the area. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Michael to speak a little bit more about the housing strategies that we can employ here.
Great, thank you so much, Uriah. And actually, one thing I'll note on the change in rent over time is that this is actually not asking rents, but it's showing the median rent paid by by tenants. And so this is inclusive of folks that live that 9% of housing that's Nycha. And so this is a pretty extreme increase over time. This isn't just kind of what's available in the market, but what actual renters are paying in this community. It's gone up quite significantly. So first and foremost, the city's approach to affordable housing is to preserve existing affordable housing. We do this through a few different mechanisms. So first is financing and safeguarding affordability. So the city offers loans and tax incentives to building owners in exchange for keeping homes affordable. So that's either entering into that government-assisted housing stock or staying in that government-assisted housing stock by re-upping affordability restrictions. Since 2014, HPD has financed the preservation of 120,000 homes in New York City, but only about 300 of those are in CD6. And this really has to do with the fact that so few housing units in CD6 are in this kind of government-assisted category of affordable housing. And part of financing and safeguarding affordability is also improving the public housing stock while safeguarding residents' tenancy rights and affordability. A huge part of preserving existing affordable housing is protecting tenants. There's a huge suite of strategies the city uses to protect tenants, but that includes a new citywide tenant hotline and portal, right to counsel for tenants facing eviction and housing court. This now applies citywide, but it has applied in the Gowanus, rezoning context area for the last around 5 years. And the HPD has recently created a new tenant anti-harassment unit with lawyers that are proactively protecting against tenant harassment. Another aspect of preserving affordable housing is promoting safe and healthy housing. We do this by improving the quality of housing through rigorous enforcement of the Housing Maintenance Code and making improvements to Nycha campuses by preserving and developing affordable housing. And finally, part of preserving existing affordable housing looks like supporting low-income homeowners, so providing loans for home repairs to low-income homeowners of 1 to 4 family homes, and one-on-one support through our new homeowner help desk, which doesn't apply to this area, but applies to areas with high concentrations of low-income homeowners, including Central Brooklyn, so nearby. But there is a citywide homeowner hotline that any homeowner can call for assistance. Part of this is tenant assistance I talked about, so eviction prevention, talked about the right to counsel law. There's services to navigate housing court through housing court answers provided by funded by HRA, and home-based homelessness prevention centers. The rental assistance is actual rental assistance and rent freeze, so one-shot deals, SCREE and DREE, which are rent tools to lower your rent. And City FEPS is a city rental assistance program, and other tools for tenants are the Mayor's Office to Protect Tenants, Office of the Tenant Advocate at the Department of Buildings, and services for tenants facing discrimination provided by the City Commission on Human Rights. So sort of the city offers a kind of a wide suite of activities to preserve existing affordable housing and help tenants. When it comes to creating new affordable housing, where the city offers loans and tax incentives to facilitate the development of affordable housing. So since 2014, we've financed 57,000 new affordable homes in New York City. But of those, less than 1% were here in Community District 6, mostly due to the high cost of land and high rents that can be charged in market rate housing in this neighborhood, make most of our loans and tax incentives unappealing to private property owners. Which really necessitates for us, new tools like implementing mandatory inclusionary housing to require permanently affordable housing in new development. Also prioritizing the development of city-owned land in this neighborhood. We are blessed to have a very large public site at which affordable housing can be constructed. So we'll talk about that in a second. And part of our work to create new affordable housing means supporting mission-driven groups mission-driven affordable housing development groups like Community Land Trust, MWBEs, and other nonprofits like in this area, the Fifth Avenue Committee. So go on a screen. This is our public site where we'll be creating around 950 affordable homes. First, this plan is to clean up and transform the site of a former manufactured gas plant into a resilient and environmentally healthy community that provides deeply affordable housing and reconnects the surrounding neighborhoods to each other and to the Gowanus Canal. So site remediation here will be part of the brownfield cleanup program. City, state, and federal oversight is included to ensure the protection of public health and the environment along with this development. The development will include approximately 36,000 square feet of retail, community facility, and commercial space. We're gonna be reserving space for a new around 500 seat public school, creating a new 1.5 acre public park plus other publicly accessible open spaces, like what's shown here on this slide, proposed shared street on McQueer Street. And will include 6 mixed-use residential buildings that will be 100% affordable, 100% in that government-assisted, income-qualified affordable housing category. And I know that 100% affordability at Gowanus Green was a huge priority for the community board, so really happy to be back at a CB meeting being able to say that. And so just a little bit more about the development. So of the housing side, so this will be 950 units of housing, 100% affordable, serving New Yorkers with a wide range of incomes. At least 50% of rental housing will be dedicated to extremely low and very low income households with incomes averaging at or below 50% of the area median income, or approximately $50,000 for a family of 3 in 2021. And as Uriah, explained, that is really dependent on the year and the household size, the apartment size, all come into factor in terms of what the rents would be. But that includes at least 15% of the rental units dedicated to formerly homeless households. No more than 40% of the rental housing would be dedicated to moderate income households with incomes averaging between 80 and 120% of the area median income, or between $85,000 and $128,000 for a family of 3. The project will include senior housing for seniors 62 years in age or more, supportive housing provided for formerly homeless disabled individuals or homeless families with a disabled head of household, and affordable homeownership will also be provided in the project with incomes averaging between 80 and 130% of the area median income. So second to last section that I'll talk about is mandatory inclusionary housing, a super important tool for the creation of affordable housing along with the Gowanus neighborhood plan. So I'm going to talk through the different options that can be mapped for MIH. So during public review, the city council can choose to impose one or both of 2 basic options. So option 1 requires that 25% of housing for households with incomes that are averaging at $61,000 or 60% of the area median income, and at least 10% must serve those that are earning $41,000 or below, or 40% AMI. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we mean when I say averaging in a second. But what this means really, just very quickly, is that in option 1, MIH would actually serve a range of incomes, probably between 40 and 80% of the area median income, which could mean that rents range from $700 for a studio at 40% AMI to around $2,000 for a 2-bedroom at 80% AMI, with a lot in between as well. Both a mix of bedroom size, house unit sizes, and a mix of AMIs. Option 2 is a little bit more affordable housing overall. I'm moving my hand, but you can't see it because of my little screen. More housing overall, but with incomes with a little bit higher average income. So incomes averaging $81,000 or $82,000 really, or 80% of the area median income, which means rents could range from around $1,500 for a studio to $2,000 for a 2-bedroom. I am noticing that actually I forgot to update this for 2021 AMI, so we're gonna fix that up tonight, and I'll send it. When we send it out to the community board, we'll make a couple slight, super minor tweaks, but I believe it's not too different. So I apologize about that error on my part. Option 3, in addition to those 2 basic options, the city council may add 1 or 2 other options. So option 3, which is part of the proposal for the Gowanus neighborhood plan, means 20% of housing for households with incomes averaging to $41,000 or 40% AMI. So this is a fewer portion of the overall units, but at deeper levels of affordability for lower income households. Subsidies only allowed if more housing is provided, and for this, rents could range from around $730 for a studio to around $930 for a 2-bedroom. And so the last that I'll show on MIH, and then I've grayed out option 4. This is not being proposed for the Gowanus neighborhood plan. It's for different types of market areas where market rate housing with MIH is not viable because market rents are too low. So this is just an example building using option 1 to show what it means when I talked about income averaging. So this is a hypothetical 100-unit building. So you've got 25 affordable apartments with option 1 and 75 market rate apartments. Of those 25 affordable ones, or of the overall 100, 10% of them have to be for households that earn 40% AMI. So here we have 10 units for households earning 40% AMI. For a 3-person household, that's around $41,000 a year. And a sample 2-bedroom rent could be around $930. 25% overall has to average to 60% AMI. And so that means that some of them are going to be above 60% AMI. So then you have another 10 units that are at 80% AMI, or $82,000 for a 3-person household. Rents for a 2-bedroom could be around $2,000. And that would be less rent for a 1-bedroom or a studio. And then you've got some in the middle at 60% AMI. So here, showing in this sample, 5 apartments for households that earn 60% of the area median income, which is around $61,000 a year. 2-bedroom rent, around $1,450. So that's MIH. Happy to take more questions about MIH, during the Q&A. The last thing I wanted to talk about the city's approach to affordable housing is the efforts we've been taking to increase access to affordable housing. So we've recently released a redesigned and improved Housing Connect website. On this site, you can apply for affordable rental, homeownership, and re-rental and resale opportunities, which is a brand new part of the Housing Connect website. It's mobile friendly. It's got improved accessibility features for people with disabilities and robust language access. I think it's in over 100 languages. And it's got new user-centered accessible design and video guides to help applicants apply. So we're really proud of this new way to apply for affordable housing. Because the re-rentals, resale opportunities, and homeownership are now part of the Housing Connect website. When New Yorkers go to look for affordable housing, there are vastly greater, more opportunities that they can find on the Housing Connect website than ever before. We've also created a new Housing Ambassadors program in the last few years. This is where the city is funding community-based service providers throughout New York City who help people prepare and apply for affordable housing through the Housing Connect. So providing really one-on-one assistance to help people get their application together, make sure they're using the website together. This is real technical assistance on the ground. We've got new, improved, and more inclusive eligibility requirements for our housing as well. So new limits on the use of credit score and credit history. We've clarified eligibility guidelines and streamlined review for self-employed applicants, which I think is really important for the Gowanus area, for folks that are artists, other makers, self-employed folks. It's much easier to apply for affordable housing than ever before. And we've added new additional protections for domestic violence survivors. This is just a few of many, many changes. Around every 2 years, we update and improve our eligibility requirements. And then last thing I will talk about is Nycha's family reentry program, which is also increasing access to affordable housing for formerly justice-involved individuals. It allows those recently released from the criminal justice system to reunite with their families in public housing. So I believe that is my last slide. It is. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I can pull the deck back up later if it's helpful during the Q&A. But I will pause and I think turn it back over to the chairs to facilitate a Q&A.
Thank you. One of the things I'd like to do, there's a 21 panelists and 26 attendees. So Samara, as our host, if you wanted to let everyone in so we can all be part of the conversation, and everyone will be muted. I ask that you raise your hand if you want to, if you have a question, and we'll come to you, and Samara will unmute you if you have a question. But we can get started. Karen.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you, everyone. I have 2 questions. One, I'll start with Housing Connect. I've had a lot of constituents back and forth that New York City Housing Connect, it gets updated, then they're blocked, they can't get into their accounts. They'll send an email and it's like forever, no answer. Basically, they just kind of give up or try to create a new account. Can you speak to what actually takes place?
And I can't speak to that much. I mean, I'm sorry that folks are experiencing bugs. I think any new website there are definitely bugs. So we do have contact info. I think I can put my information in the chat, and we can share your eyes as well. We're always happy to help troubleshoot. And then we do have these housing ambassadors that do serve this area. Fifth Avenue Committee is a housing ambassador for the Gowanus area, and I think can also assist in helping people apply.
Okay, but for in general, is there like is there a phone number if they send an email and they're not getting any response?
Yeah, I mean, they can always reach us at 212-863-8600 is kind of HPD's main, phone number, and through that they can get routed to the right folks. And
Okay.
that website, that info is on our website, and I don't know if there's a specific Housing Connect phone number, but we can look into that, and I can put the answer to that in the chat, during the later part of this meeting.
Okay, and question 2. The presentation that you showed, it would be 10% of the 950 units, which would probably be about 95, and people can earn 40,000 and less. Why has that 10% not been able to be increased? Is that like a standard New York, like deal that's made, or is that by builder? I'm trying to figure it out, because this always comes up no matter what, where or how, because for 950 units to go up in an area you're trying to make sure that everyone's there, or it's diversified, and maybe someone that lives in Gowanus houses want to try and move to this new development.
Yeah, so I'm going to pull my slides back up because I want to kind of separate out two different things. So first is the Gowanus Green development. That's the 950 unit development public site that is 100% affordable. Actually, I'm not going to pull the slide back up because I can just say this. Within that development, half of the apartments, not 10%, half of the apartments will be for households that earn 50% of the area median income or less. And so that's a really significant chunk of the rental apartments in Gowanus Green are going to be for extremely low, very low income New Yorkers. So that's in Gowanus Green side. And then in addition to Gowanus Green, any new building that gets built as a result of the rezoning would come with mandatory inclusionary housing. And that's where any development would have some amount of affordable housing of those developments. With option 1 of mandatory inclusionary housing, as I kind of mentioned, there's multiple options that are going to get mapped along with the rezoning. And part of the public conversation that we're going to have as part of the approval of this rezoning is which are the right options to get mapped. And so with option 1, that's the one I showed the example, where it's a 100-unit building. 10 of them are for people that earn 40% of the area median income. 5 of them are for people that are 60% of the area median income. 10 are for 80. Option 3, all of them are actually for all of the affordable units are for households that earn 40% of the area median income. It's about 20% of the overall building. And so, as I said, this is a little bit of part of what, part of CV6's review of this is are these the right options? Right now, we've proposed to map options 1, 2, and 3. Option 2, as a reminder, was a higher portion of the units. It's 30% of the overall units, but a slightly higher income, so 80% of the area median income. So I hope that kind of clarified that there's actually, it's much more than 10% that would serve, the lowest incomes. It's actually a pretty significant chunk of the affordable units.
Okay, thank you.
Alec?
Thank you. I think one concern I have about the plan right now is based on the sort of way that the city does community preference for lottery for apartments. I understand that the way this works is that generally residents of a community district are given a distinct preference in who will receive one of the available affordable apartments. And in community districts that are predominantly low income, people of color. That's very important to avoid developments creating a kind of displacement effect. But in Community Board 6, which is has a different demographic profile, that kind of community preference could cut against the same interests in greater integration that I think are motivating some of us to be very passionate and excited about the housing component of this plan, right? Because we see this rezoning as a chance to win back some of the racial diversity in particular that our community has lost over the last few decades. And as someone who grew up here in Park Slope in the 90s, I can tell you the demographic profile of our neighborhood has changed very markedly in that time. And anybody who's been here can tell you that. So I'd like to know what options the city has for tweaking the community preference formula in this case, whether that means adding in other community districts that have a different demographic profile, that are neighbored to ours, that could be added as having that community preference, or other tweaks that might be available to address that concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. I think that's a very interesting point and an important point. Under current city policy, residents of the community district in which the housing is built receive a preference for 50% of the housing units. Community preference in lotteries is currently under active litigation, and city officials and staff cannot comment on the policy at this time. Brooklyn Community Board 6 obviously is welcome to provide your feedback or your desires, and we will certainly take that under the consideration, but I unfortunately cannot comment further at this time.
Ariel, if you don't mind, I just want to raise that and I hope that the members of this committee and the members of the community board and the community that are on here will keep that in mind as we continue to think about this process, the goals we have, and what recommendations we might have with respect to community preference to achieve the demographic goals I think that at least the community board has in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Guy.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a question on the rezoning side. I think we've had a lot of focus on the affordable housing units that would be mandatory to create. But in terms of the existing housing stock, are there specific reports on the impact of the naturally occurring affordable housing, how it's been impacted by similar rezonings in other areas? Because I guess I'm concerned that what may wind up happening is that naturally occurring affordable housing might be displaced or reduced, and then the mandatory inclusionary housing might turn out to be a wash or not cover the gap. So I'm curious if in previous rezonings there have been hard data that's come out about what's happened with the naturally occurring affordable housing in areas where rezonings have gone forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think I should first clarify that I don't believe that there is naturally occurring affordable housing in Community District 6. This is a very expensive neighborhood. I think we showed median rents had gone up by 36%, significantly more than the city overall. And so apartments that are not, specifically rent stabilized or income restricted, I do not believe that there is, housing that folks would think of as affordable in this community under the current conditions. In terms of, how increase in housing supply might in terms of how an increase in housing supply might impact the rents of adjacent housing units, I think research on this topic is hotly debated in the urban planning and housing policy communities. I think emerging research does suggest that new housing, even market rate housing, does actually not increase rents of nearby apartments, and actually in most cases relieves upward pressure on rent, relieves demand, and thus contributes to lower rents and housing overall, but that's not true certainly in all cases. And so really definitely depends on what type of housing, the neighborhood, the underlying conditions that are there. But I think that certainly an assumption that new housing would increase the rents of nearby housing is not one that I would agree with.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking specifically about recent rezonings in, for example, other parts of Brooklyn, where you could, look at the resulting rent in the neighborhood and see whether, there has actually been an impact similar to what was predicted.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing is certainly a very interesting and would be a very challenging research project. I think part of that analysis is also understanding or making assumptions about what would have happened absent the rezoning. Rents, in neighborhoods all over New York City have gone up over time. And I think, looking at rezoned areas and whether rents have gone up more than similar neighborhoods that haven't been rezoned, I don't know that off the top of my head. I don't believe that in East New York, for example, that you've seen, higher increases in rent after the rezoning than you would have before.
I'd add a couple things. One, I think Michael, or the presentation early on, noted also zoning is, for a very long term. And so recent rezonings are we're not gonna be able to really be able to look at those and see what happened. It's just gonna take time for East New York and Jerome and other things to play out. But we have actually done a recent look back on the Greenpoint Williamsburg rezoning and plan. And we can probably drop the link in the chat at some point. And I can't recall if they actually got into rents, but I think a proxy that this committee has asked about, and part of the subject of the presentation has also been about the sort of racial demographic makeup. And actually there's been some interesting data and results that when we looked at this look back at the Greenpoint Williamsburg, we found that actually there was a sharp decrease actually in minority groups before the rezoning, and then after post rezoning, it actually stabilized and increased in some groups, and in a statistically meaningful way. And so actually I would recommend you read that. There's also really good info in there about jobs. I think I saw Paul Basile wrote a couple of questions in the chat. I think it's also relevant where job increases also stabilize and increase at the same time in the M zones adjacent to the area that was rezoned for residential. So
Thank you.
Glenn, I think your hand was up next.
Sure, I put some of my questions in the chat, but let me move on to the other ones. I don't know if you can go back to page 34. You mentioned something in there that a subsidy is allowed only if there's additional housing. I didn't understand that. Maybe you could explain. Yeah, subsidy is allowed only if more housing is provided. What does that mean?
Yeah, so basically, so this is written into the zoning. Basically, this what that is supposed to mean is that if a developer is using option 3 and they're providing 20% of the housing for this lower income, they can't get a tax incentive in order to fulfill that. They have to provide more housing on top of that to fulfill the mandate, basically. So if the city is providing additional subsidy, we need to see more than 20% of the units being affordable in order to receive that subsidy. I should clarify, though, that the city does not subsidize any mandatory inclusionary housing units. We don't subsidize MIH units. So if a project is receiving city subsidy and is doing kind of 100% affordable housing, they need to provide more housing that's permanently affordable than what would have been required under MIH to ensure that we're not, basically paying for what would have been an obligation of the developer.
Well, of course, we are paying it through our tax exemption, and the upzoning, that's paying for it.
I guess certainly on the tax, the tax incentives, the tax incentives that currently exist, the state's 421A tax incentive The depth of affordability that's required by mandatory inclusionary housing is much deeper than what's required by the 421A program. And so, under 421A, you're required to receive that as of right tax exemption. You're required to provide 25% of the housing, and under one of the options that can be at 130% of the area median income. In a mandatory inclusionary housing area, you're going way deeper than that. And yes, you can still receive that same tax incentive that anyone outside of a mandatory inclusionary housing incentive or mandatory inclusionary housing area could receive, but in this case, you're providing much deeper affordability. So yes, the programs do work together. 421A and MIH, are essentially intended to be
So
used.
I won't mention the ones that I put in the chat, and hopefully they'll be answered by someone. But the one thing I didn't get in there is since we're shooting for permanent affordable housing, how does that work with the affordable home ownership? Is the subsidy recaptured at some point?
I'm sorry, I was reading your question in the chat and
Okay.
not listening to the question you said. So could
Yeah,
you repeat the question?
You can't do those two things at once.
Yeah, my apologies.
Yeah. So since we're trying to make this permanently affordable, how does it work with the affordable home ownership? When those homes are then sold, is the subsidy recaptured so that it continues to be permanently affordable?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with mandatory inclusionary housing, the obligation for mandatory inclusionary housing, it's in the zoning and it's recorded on the deed of the property at the time that that building is constructed. If they choose for the home ownership option of MIH, they would need to sell the homes at a price including co-op and condo fees and utilities that is affordable to a household that meets the income eligibility. And when that is resold later, that next household would also have to meet that. And so it's basically a limited equity home ownership where the amount of appreciation for that first homeowner can only go up to whatever the next homeowner who also meets that income qualification. But that low-income homeowner would be paying down a mortgage and building equity through that way, and they would recoup that amount. And that similarly would apply for the home ownership units that we're intending to facilitate at the Gowanus Green development. Basically, there would be a formula that allows limited increases in sales price over time to ensure that it stays affordable in the long term.
Except in New York and San Francisco, I mean, housing can be a risky investment. So what is your experience with an arrangement like that? Because it makes it even trickier. You don't really know what you'll be selling your house for and who you're selling your house to until these formulas are worked out in the future, right?
Yeah, I mean, the formulas are relatively simple. They're, certainly on the Gowanus Green side, where you've got, affordable homeownership that's financed by HPD, it's a fixed percent increase over time. Yes, if the market goes down, then you might sell at a loss, which is true for any homeowner anywhere. And I think that, thinking about a limited equity homeownership, affordable homeownership takes a little bit of a flip that when you think about wealth building and growth and equity, it's about, paying down that mortgage and the amount that you're investing there instead of paying rent. What are the wealth building effects of that versus renting rather than about, what type of land price appreciation can I get if the neighborhood improves? Can I sell this for more? It's kind of a different type of homeownership.
Of course, it's worth doing. I just, want some confidence that it will work. That's all. I'm done.
Okay, let's take one more question from Samara, and then if there's any other questions, I think in the old days we used to we would also put questions together. We sent them to DCP and HPD, and they would come back with answers. So, do we have that option, prior to the next round of this, if we get a list of questions that we were not able to answer tonight to you?
Yeah, I mean, we're happy to answer questions. I mean, this isn't the one and only time we're coming to the community board, so we can figure out.
It's a matter of timing though. There's not a lot of time factor, so get stuff to you as quickly as we can and hope we're around. But we'll take one more on housing from Samara, and we'll move on to the.
Hey, yeah. I actually have a question about maintenance. From what I've heard from a lot of my neighbors in Nycha, there have been a lot of times if they need to get sort of their homes inspected to sort of discover any potential HPD violations or get an EHP process started, it's been quite difficult in order to get those violations actually transmitted to the right place to get things fixed. They sort of get canceled by HPD inspectors. I wanted to ask whether what the sort of situation will be for people living in the new Gowanus Green development, whether they will have access to the same rights as anybody living in currently affordable housing, according to sort of a privately owned but rent controlled or stabilized housing, as opposed to a lot of folks in Nycha who have not been able to exercise that particular right.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, folks that are living in Gowanus Green, this is private housing. It will be a building that is owned by the Gowanus Green Development Group, and folks who have complaints about their housing conditions will be able to call 311 and have an HPD inspector visit and inspect the complaints. I would say that folks living in Gowanus Green Development would have kind of greater protection than an average tenant living in a non-affordable building, because the housing quality is also regulated by our agreement, the city's agreement with the owners of the building. So it is not like Nycha. For folks who aren't aware, the city does not, city housing inspectors do not respond to complaints in Nycha. If a Nycha tenant calls 311, that's responded to by Nycha, not HPD housing inspectors. So in this, it would be different than Nycha. It would be more like any private building.
Okay, thanks.
Are there any other questions on housing before we move on to the next presentation on the IBZ? Okay. Jonathan, are you doing that?
Jonah will be presenting and will be supporting him.
Great. Just give me a moment to share my screen. Can everybody see? Great. So just by way of introduction, I just want to say that, we've done a lot of work to get here. I'll be going into the background and providing context, but just want to start off by thanking many members of the board. I see folks from Gowanus Alliance on the line, as well as the Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation, SBIDC. Will be presenting highlights of the Gowanus Vision Plan today. This has really been a joint effort, and so I'm just really excited to be here to present. So as a quick intro for our, or just to start off with an agenda, I'll be providing some brief background on the study, how we got here, its overall context. And then we'll also be touching on how the existing conditions work fed into our thinking around the IBZ, as well as the outreach and engagement, which was instrumental in shaping the plan. And then finally, we'll dive into the vision plan itself and talk through the goals and strategies. So just to start off with some context, the developing the plan for the IBZ portion of Gowanus has been a priority we've heard since our early outreach for the neighborhood plan. In the Gowanus framework from 2018, we actually included a commitment to advance a vision plan for the IBZ with the goal of reinforcing the area as a jobs hub for industrial use, but also for commercial businesses as well. In 2019, we kicked off the formal study, analyzing existing conditions and holding a number of outreach meetings to get ideas and feedback. And then based on that engagement period and analysis of existing conditions, we move forward with developing a land use framework, and then also identified priorities for infrastructure and workforce development. At this moment, I want to state upfront that the vision plan is not a rezoning proposal like the Gowanus framework of 2018. It's more of a vision with general parameters for, and in this case, it's really intended to inform private applications that can move forward, but also serve as a platform that can guide future development and priorities for investment. And just a quick note on the geography of the area we looked at. What we're calling the study area is outlined in dark blue. It covers the southern part of the Gowanus neighborhood, located directly below the area of the Gowanus neighborhood plan, which is currently going through ULURP. Because the Southwest Brooklyn IBZ boundary, shaded in pink color, only covers portions of certain blocks, we felt it was important to include a slightly larger area, covering both the entire portions of blocks that overlap with the IBZ, but also 3rd Avenue, both sides, to give us a more holistic understanding of the corridor, which, as we know, is an important gateway that serves the IBZ. So now, for context on existing conditions, I just want to provide some background on what serves as a foundation for our planning work for jobs. So before the pandemic, the city was experiencing a booming economy with about 216,000 jobs added in Brooklyn from 2010 to 2019. Although all major economic sectors grew in this period, a sign of our city's strength in its economy, the healthcare and education sectors, as well as the office-based sectors, accounted for a substantial share of this job growth. And then when thinking about what makes a good location for job growth, one key metric that we use is looking at places that are accessible already to existing job centers, whether that's traditional central business districts like Lower Manhattan or downtown Brooklyn, or local job hubs located in the borough. And when compared to other IBZs, and the shown on the right side of the slide, the southern part of Gowanus is really well situated, both for local and regional job hubs, and well connected to our mass transit system. So for a little more context, the Gowanus Vision Plan really builds on a number of local and citywide planning efforts. These include citywide initiatives like One NYC, the Mayor's Industrial Action Plan, and more recently, the New York Works Job Plan, which set forth a number of goals to diversify our economy and provide well-paying, qualifying jobs. And then within the Department of City Planning, or DCP, we've completed a number of studies that have guided how we plan in industrial areas. These include a feasibility study on mixing industrial with commercial or residential uses. It also includes the North Brooklyn Industrial and Innovation Plan, which was a sweeping study that really laid the groundwork for a host of land use and planning tools that we often adapt to other industrial areas. And then finally, the Resilient Industry report, which developed targeted recommendations for how industrial businesses in particular can retrofit buildings and better protect against flooding. I would say above all, this plan is mostly informed by locally driven planning efforts, starting with the Gowanus Brownfield Opportunity Area report, the Bridging Gowanus Community Plan, and most recently, the Gowanus Framework, which, as I mentioned, served as the main impetus for the Gowanus IBZ Vision Plan. So now that we've provided some background, I want to dive into existing conditions, starting with what are some of the areas defining characteristics and key assets. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the area is really well connected to mass transit, as well as major job hubs like downtown Brooklyn and smaller job hubs in other parts of the IBZ and Sunset Park or Red Hook. It's also flanked by Carroll Gardens to the west and Park Slope to the east, two predominantly residential neighborhoods that are well established, and also where the IBZ can function as a jobs hub where people have the opportunity to walk and bike to work. And as we know, with the growth of new housing and jobs in the Gowanus neighborhood plan area to the north, which is shaded gray in the map, that walk to work dynamic, we anticipate to further increase and expand. And then just looking at the local transportation network, this is another great tool to help us understand the area. This particular area benefits from a number of local truck routes, as we know, Hamilton Avenue, 3rd and 4th Avenue, and 9th Street, which is an important cross-canal connection. And at the southern border of the study is also the BQE, which is a critical asset for the movement and supply of goods and services, especially for the truck-intensive industrial businesses. So now just turning the attention to land use and zoning. As part of our internal work in 2019, we conducted a land use survey of every block and lot in the area. And I'll just take a quick moment to summarize our key findings. Starting with the large waterfront blocks east of 2nd Avenue, most of these lots contain multiple acres, some of which are partially built up. But I would say in many cases, portions of these lots are used for storage and parking open uses. In contrast, the blocks between 2nd and 3rd Avenues contain smaller size lots, generally between 5 to 20,000 square feet, and these lots are much more built up, often with buildings that extend the full lot coverage, and with 1 to 2 story warehouses, primarily with industrial uses. Meanwhile, there are also clusters of residential, which predate the current zoning and are legally non-conforming. And then we have 3rd Avenue, which is an important truck route, but also serves as a mixed-use corridor with local shops and businesses. In terms of zoning, except for a few pockets of M11 and M12, the area is mostly zoned M21, a designation that's been in place since 1961 and really reflects a slightly different era when there was heavy industry lining a larger portion of the canal. And its parking requirements were set really high, anticipating a future where cars and trucks would be the primary mode of doing business for industry. And then on the east side of 3rd Avenue, that portion is zoned R6A with a commercial overlay, and that was rezoned as part of the 2003 Park Slope rezoning. So another lens to understand local land use, we decided to calculate the total lot area for each type of use. As expected for a mostly industrial and commercially zoned area, industrial and commercial uses represent the majority of the total lot area, with industrial accounting for the highest percentage among all types of uses. Further, we found that more than a quarter of the area is used for some combination of parking or vehicle storage, other types of auto-related use like gas stations or repair shops, or lots that are vacant or contain what we call open storage. So taking a deeper look at the industrial use category, as well as similar types of industrial use for storage or transportation related, we see a diverse mix of construction, distribution and warehousing, manufacturing, and other types of industrial. Many lots have a mix of both industrial and commercial tenants, especially north of 9th Street. And just to help illustrate the variety of industrial uses, on one side, we have long-standing, larger scale manufacturing businesses, some that have been in operation for generations, like Architectural Grill. And then on the other hand, we have more emerging types of industrial, or often we coin maker type uses, and that in some cases overlap with arts and office space uses. And those businesses tend to occupy smaller, even shared spaces sometimes in loft style buildings, like Brooklyn Glass on 13th Street. And then taking a look at commercial uses, we also mapped out this category. The biggest commercial businesses by both lot area and employment are represented by larger retail establishments like the Whole Foods supermarket or the Lowe's hardware store, while 3rd Avenue is more of the traditional mixed-use corridor with local retail and services on the ground floor, residential above. And then kind of in the middle of that, we have a handful of multi-story former industrial buildings that have been repurposed either for other types of industrial or for a mix of artist studios, offices, and other types of commercial. Now, taking a look at development trends, the area's experienced a fair amount of activity, which is a great sign of investment. Since 2010, there have been over 70 total Department of Buildings permits to either construct new buildings or complete major alterations, like gut rehabs or enlargements. During this period, an assortment of properties have received support from the city's industrial and commercial tax abatement program, known as ICAP, or there's also the ISIP program, further indicating that owners are making substantial investments that also contribute to the area's job density. As shown in the photos, the types of development and investment vary. There are large ground-up single tenant developments like Whole Foods, and also developments like 530 3rd Avenue, which I believe Paul worked to develop, that provide flex space for smaller businesses and tenants that may not need as large space. So it's kind of serving different demographics of businesses. On the top left, or excuse me, the top right, I believe, that's the Salvation Army warehouse enlargement, which is a good example of an industrial use expanding and growing in place. While the cluster of buildings from 519 to 529 3rd Avenue is an example of an adaptive reuse project that blends a commercial component like co-working and retail with an industrial component like a brewery, in addition to a rooftop greenhouse. And I think, just as a side point, if there was an award for the most Gowanus type of development, the 3rd Avenue building might win that award just by the nature of the combination of its uses. I also want to note on the slide that since the pandemic, we've heard that even despite supply chain challenges, there has been an uptick in demand for industrial spaces, particularly warehousing and distribution. So now, as part of our study, we took a closer look at local employment trends, estimating about 4,000 total private jobs in the vision plan area, which is evenly split between commercial and industrial jobs. Compared to other IBZs, this area has a relatively high job density per acre and a greater percentage of retail jobs, although this is partly a reflection of some of the large retail businesses like Lowe's or Whole Foods and the inclusion of 3rd Avenue. Over the past couple decades, the amount of retail, leisure, and hospitality jobs has grown substantially, while industrial has remained more stable. And you can even see a rebound since the 2009 period when the recession hit. Among the types of industrial jobs, there's been a decline in manufacturing that's consistent with what we see across the city and even nationwide. But this has largely been offset by the growth in construction and wholesale trade jobs. And just as a quick note, I want to clarify that this data was collected before the pandemic, so unfortunately we don't have newer data to pull from. But that being said, we do believe that these trends over the past 20 years are really valuable insights that help not only inform the current plan, but how we envision the future of this part of the IBZ. So because much of the area is located in a low-lying area by the Gowanus Canal, I want to recognize that flooding is a very pressing challenge for businesses and property owners, whether the flooding is caused by rainstorms, chronic drainage issues. A large portion of the waterfront blocks sit within the 1% annual chance or 100-year floodplain, shown in dark blue, where there's a high risk of coastal flooding. Other portions shown in light blue are within the 0.2% annual chance or 500-year floodplain, where there's less risk today, but we like to show that as a rough approximation of where we actually see the future 100-year floodplain in 2050 when we account for projected sea level rise. So now we're going to the next phase of the presentation. I want to touch on the outreach and engagement we've had, which has played a key role in our planning work. This really began before the formal announcement of our study when we were working on the Gowanus framework, and we convened a series of meetings for the Industry and Economic Development Working Group. And then after we formally kicked off the vision plan study in the spring of 2019, we held 2 business roundtable discussions and also facilitated an online survey. And we've held a few more recent or frequent meetings with a smaller group of stakeholders and local leaders, which has also been incredibly helpful. And then just to summarize what we've heard, I kind of grouped these into 6 buckets. First are general issues related to zoning and constraints on space, whether there isn't enough floor area to build what I'd like to and meet the demand for businesses, or parking and loading requirements are quite restrictive and impede the ability to develop or enlarge. Second, we hear general concerns about just maintaining and growing the local economy, sensitivity about what types of jobs do we want to see grow and produced in the area, and what types of spaces are necessary to accommodate that growth. Third, we hear specific infrastructure issues, primarily related to flooding, to lack of broadband access, all of which are critical for businesses to run. Fourth, there are specific quality of life issues. These are really common in industrial areas that are positioned closely to residential. So where you have people living near where businesses are operating at different hours of the day, those are basic quality of life issues that we take seriously and we consider in our land use framework. Fifth, transportation was a big issue, specifically along 3rd Avenue, where we've heard is a source of congestion and pinch points. But it's also more of there are local issues that are tied to specific streets, whether trucks are trying to turn onto narrow streets, or where there are constraints on loading and shipments along the street. And then finally, we know that sustainability is an issue, and this ties into infrastructure as well, about how do we reduce stormwater runoff, how do we retrofit existing industrial buildings to be more environmentally sustainable, whether that's through solar panels measures to lower energy costs and our overall carbon footprint. So now that we've gone over existing conditions and outreach and engagement, we're going to devote the rest of the presentation to the kind of the meat and highlights of the vision plan. Before going into the land use framework, I just want to provide 3 principles that really guided our approach. So first and foremost, we set out to create a vision, which is anticipating, has to consider significant growth in the northern part of Gowanus, and considering, not just the way conditions are today, but what we see as a future and allowing the Gowanus portion of the IBZ to really thrive while there's growth in the northern part of the neighborhood. Second, we sought to establish a land use framework that can guide private applications. It can be used by them, and consider how their proposals can better meet the goals that we share with the community. Third, as part of the framework, we identified 4 sub-areas with different conditions and planning goals that we'll go into shortly, being mindful of how these goals can also adapt as the market shifts in the future. One way that we went about identifying sub-areas, in addition to our overall existing condition analysis, was mapping the land use character of block frontages on either side of the street, what we refer to as the social block. And then based on this analysis, we found that many blocks on the north of 12th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues have a greater concentration of industrial that's interspersed with either residential or commercial. In contrast, many of the social blocks below 12th Street along 2nd, and as well as the 2nd Avenue corridor, are almost entirely industrial. So that was just one immediate characteristic that really stuck in our mind with how we thought of the framework. So now, before going into the sub areas, I think we wanted to highlight 5 overarching goals. First being increasing flexibility for existing industrial businesses. We want to ensure they have the ability to grow and support their operations, especially those that rely on trucks, because those tend to be very sensitive to specific locations. Second, we wanted to support industrial arts and other job generating sectors, keeping an eye towards what jobs are here in Gowanus now, but also what can grow in the future, how these jobs contribute to the local economy, and really build on the area's competitive assets. Third, we wanted to just lay out very plainly that we want to encourage job density, given the proximity to transit, to residential neighborhoods. And this was a real goal that we've heard from the get-go. And then the 5th goal relates to the larger waterfront sites and connects to the Gowanus neighborhood plan goal as well, regarding improving pedestrian access and circulation. So those sites tend to be very large, and we think that that's an opportunity for better pedestrian access, connecting the people to the waterfront. And where there is commercial use that would trigger waterfront access, increasing the amount of waterfront public access along the canal. And then finally, the residential uses that are there today, many of which are non-conforming, we do think that they should be recognized, and we should find a way to make them, give them a little more flexibility than they have today, and in a way that doesn't interfere with businesses on that block. Okay, so as part of the framework, we identified 4 sub-areas, each with their own set of goals and strategies. These include the Smith and 9th Street transit node and upland areas, the areas that are more interspersed with a mix of commercial, industrial uses, and closer to the Gowanus neighborhood plan area. Second, large waterfront blocks on the east side of the canal, which are kind of their own animal, and we felt it was important to treat these a little separately. Third, industrial, what we're calling industrial intensive areas in the southern part of the area, the neighborhood closer to the BQE. And then fourth, the Third Avenue corridor. And we've also lumped that together with some of the residential clusters on the mid-block. So starting with the Smith and Ninth transit node and upland area, this is an area that with close proximity to the train, as well as the Gowanus neighborhood plan area, as I mentioned. In this sub area, we felt it was important to first just recognize the existing industrial and art space uses that are there, being sensitive to those uses, but also think about other types of office and retail based businesses that can locate there and grow. So we see this as more of like a mixed commercial industrial area. And then we identified 2nd Avenue and 9th Street as just corridors, compared to mid-blocks that can potentially accommodate more density. And then with respect to specific strategies, we do feel that increased FAR is certainly appropriate here. And in certain instances like 300 Huntington is a great example where because it's close to the subway, we feel it's important to really connect to the waterfront and improve overall connectivity. And as I mentioned, really encourage a mix of all types of job dense uses. Moving on to the waterfront blocks. These are large sites that we don't necessarily see as being developed right away. They're more of a long-term vision. And I think similar to the upland areas, we think of this as a great place to have a mix of job dense uses. But that being said, we do want to consider how to kind of break these larger lots down if they are redeveloped to improve connectivity, whether it's extending the street grid or bringing more connections to the waterfront. These are also sites that will need a lot of site planning and complex infrastructure issues just being closer to the canal. So we wanted to find a way to recognize that. Third, there are the industrial intensive areas. As I mentioned, the area south of 12th Street is almost entirely industrial. It's very close to the highway in Hamilton Ave. The ground floors, for the most part, are occupied by more of the traditional industrial uses that really depend on the first floor for truck access and loading. We feel it's important to, as much as possible, support that concentration of industrial and truck intensive uses while giving more flexibility for businesses. So from a strategy point of view, we do think that increased FAR is important for this area, as well as an incentive for industrial or arts production-based uses that really thrive in this location. And then second, given the sensitivity of these businesses, we want to ensure that other uses that locate here are really compatible with those existing and future truck based uses to ensure that the businesses that are there have an opportunity to really thrive. And then finally, the mixed use corridor, the clusters of residential. This is an area that we'd like to, thinking holistically about 3rd Avenue. It's an existing mixed use corridor. We think it's appropriate to promote some more commercial there, whether it's increasing FAR encourage multiple floors, but also just recognize the existing residential there, bring those uses into conformance, and allow some form of modest growth, just given how close it is to transit and being on a wide corridor. And then finally, the mid-block residential clusters, we think that it's important to bring those as well into conformance, but being at an appropriate scale for the community. So now that we've talked about the land use framework, we're going to go over the infrastructure and workforce development section. And these are really tied to our approach, similar to the land use framework, was setting out for what are the tools that we have today? How do we build on existing programs and initiatives? We want to assess what are the current and future needs of the area, keeping an eye towards a more job dense 21st century hub of employment. And as part of that, we identified goals and strategies like the land use framework. And so starting with transportation, I think the top concern that we heard is that 3rd Avenue should remain an important truck route to access the BQE and serve businesses on the mid blocks. We think that 3rd Avenue is a great location to examine further. We know that there's a bike lane in a portion of the avenue. We know that certain areas by the BQE is a real bottleneck for congestion for a lot of through traffic that comes to access the BQE. And so we kind of put that up front to really look at 3rd Avenue more closely. In addition, we also think that 2nd Avenue is important. It's kind of this, it doesn't have so much activity, but it's also the spine of the IBZ. It's heavily industrial. And then 9th Street as well is very narrow. It's there's also a bike lane there. And as we're thinking about growth in the area, it's important to think, how do we accommodate different road users, particularly on 9th Street being one of the few cross canal connections. DOT just released their smart truck management plan. And I don't know if folks recall from our outreach, many staff from their freight division were actually directly involved with the study, which was really helpful. We think there are some great tools that from that work that we could apply to the Gowanus IBZ, specifically the clean truck program, and also ways to improve wayfinding, tweaking the truck route network if that's appropriate. Loading is a major issue. I think there could be there may be a need for increasing the amount of loading zones. At the same time, we're considering how urban freight is evolving and ways to consolidate that to reduce the impacts of deliveries and trucks associated with those uses. The second part of the transportation strategies, we took a closer look at parking and loading. The North Brooklyn Industry and Innovation Plan provides a great set of tools that we feel could be adapted to the Gowanus IBZ, in particular, consolidated loading and staging zones to improve coordination or ways that businesses can share loading areas. Second, pop-up consolidation centers for loading and queuing space on a similar note. And then pedestrian-oriented streetscape design. So thinking of how, 3rd Avenue, where more pedestrians are, how does that meet portions of the mid-blocks between 2nd and 3rd, which are really, we want to delineate, what are pedestrian-friendly areas versus what are the more truck-intensive areas where loading is going to affect the streetscape. And then finally, We also want to explore more opportunities for parking under the Gowanus Expressway. Lack of parking was a major concern for businesses, and when we spoke with DOT, that was one opportunity that we wanted to look more closely at. And then we also know that the sanitation garages do have trucks that park on site. I believe a lot has been improved on that, but it's just an issue that we're mindful of, just given the lack of on-street parking space. And then on the topic of sustainability and resiliency, first, we want to improve the drainage infrastructure and prevent as much as possible street flooding and combined sewer overflow. DEP is currently advancing work on the site called the Salt Lot, where they anticipate another CSO facility. That's one part of the problem. The other part is just 9th Street and 2nd Avenue being such a focal point for flooding. DEP has committed millions of dollars towards the project. We've been closely coordinating with them, and they are also currently interested in expanding that work to 10th Street. And so we want to keep that momentum and ensure that as the neighborhood grows, that kind of the full network of sewer and drainage infrastructure is improved. The second part of our sustainability recommendation relates to the buildings itself. So buildings like Architectural Grill and others have installed solar panels. Some have used existing programs like Solarize NYC or Retrofit Accelerator. We'd like to encourage more businesses to participate in that. I believe DOT will be installing some solar panels at their freight facility on the southern part of the study area. And as buildings redevelop, that's also an opportunity for them to meet the latest energy and building codes. So just by nature of redeveloping, that's a great step forward to reaching our neighborhood-wide sustainability. I just want to flag too that recently we adopted a citywide proposal called Zoning for Coastal Flood Resiliency. As part of that work, one great recommendation which stemmed from the Resilient Industry Report was how do we retrofit, how do we improve resiliency for existing manufacturing or industrial buildings that have high floor ceiling heights and they can't really, elevate their full structure. And so one strategy we're implementing right now is to give extra floor area for mezzanine spaces. So that way industrial businesses can elevate their critical mechanical equipment or inventory. So we think this is a really important measure to retrofit buildings that are already existing. And then turning to workforce development, I just want to start by saying that the workforce development community in Gowanus is quite strong. You have the Southwest Brooklyn Industrial Development Corporation, SBIDC, which manages the Workforce One Career Center at Sunset Park, specialized in industrial jobs. We're fortunate to have an even more local organization like the Gowanus Alliance, which is focused on supporting industrial businesses within the IBC portion of Gowanus. And then finally, we have Brooklyn Workforce Innovations, which is part of Fifth Avenue Committee, and it's kind of their workforce development arm to better connect available jobs with job seekers, many of whom are low-income residents in the area. So when we framed our workforce development goals, I think first and foremost, we'd like to continue supporting the neighborhood-based organizations, their local service providers, and as much as possible, facilitate connection between residents and existing and future businesses, particularly with an eye towards the Nycha campuses, which you heard is a really important place to increase access for jobs and provide more skills and training. The second part of that is, we'd like to build up more of an inventory of employment opportunities. We weren't, working with BWI or Gowanus Alliance. We think that's just important to monitor and track as we move forward with the Gowanus Neighborhood Plan and the Gowanus Vision Study. And then lastly, connecting with local schools and institutions, some of which have vocational education, which is really the starting point for many career pathways, and ensuring that local students are aware of kind of the growing industrial and sustainability based sectors in Gowanus. And then lastly, we want to reinforce and build upon the programs that the city offers. So starting with the Workforce One Career Center, which is managed by SBIDC at the Brooklyn Army Terminal. This is a great place to have to be a focal point for growing Gowanus and its industrial businesses. And then second, we know that some businesses have participated in Apprenticeship NYC. It's a relatively new program, I believe, managed by the Department of Small Business Services. It's a great program that provides pre-apprenticeship and internship opportunities and places them in more like targeted industrial programs. At the moment, it's more of a pilot program, but maybe there's a way to really make this Gowanus focus. And this is something that our partners at SBS were also interested in. And then finally, we'd like to promote certain types of businesses that are thriving in Gowanus today and we expect to grow. So we've highlighted certain types of advanced manufacturing, the waste and recycling services, whether it's big reuse or US recycling. The construction industry is also growing, and at the same time, there are smaller metal fabricators and woodworkers. So we'd like to find a way to promote those, through marketing or to think about how they can be better woven into a broader strategy for the neighborhood. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Thanks for bearing with me. This is a lot of work went into this. So again, I want to thank, I see Paul, Jesse, Ben, Brad's office. This is a real collective effort. So I'm just really proud to get to the stage, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. I guess we have quite a number of questions that popped right up there, so I might as well get started. I think, Samara, is your hand still up from last time, or?
Still up from last time. Sorry about that, Aria.
All right, Guy.
Thank you. I was curious, during the housing discussion, we talked about kind of the trends in rent and the breakdown between ownership and rent. Do you have a sense on the commercial side in the IBZ study area, how many of the businesses in that area own versus rent, and what the trend of the commercial rents are in the area?
I don't have a specific breakdown of ownership versus renters, but we know that there's a mix. There are certain owners that are more prominent and have multiple properties, and there are also many circumstances where properties are subleased or have smaller tenants. We're also fortunate to have Paul Bazile, and I think he can probably speak to that as well. And then as far as commercial rents, they really range. You have certain industrial properties are lower, like the $20 a square foot rent or lower than that, and then on the higher end, you have commercial spaces, I think, in the $40 or $50 square foot, but those are more smaller. And this is also a more like anecdotal study. So these are just specific instances. We don't have like a full snapshot of all of the properties and rents.
Thank you.
Paul, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I don't have exact numbers either, but we can work on that through our outreach. I just wanted to take the first part of this and thank Jonah and the DCP team for all the outreach they've done and all the work they've done. And they've definitely hit many, if not all of the points that we had as concerns as a community in the IBZ. Also to the councilman's office for their continued support and their willingness to listen and to be responsive to many of the concerns that we have as we move forward. And through the partnership with Ben and his team over at Southwest Brooklyn and the larger, more prominent property owners in Gowanus IBZ, we know that given the hard work that they've done here and providing this vision that we can turn this into a plan and we can provide the types of growth that we think would be supportive to the overall, city needs. And hoping that not only with this new information or this better guide to information, but the lessons that we're learning from the pandemic and other citywide issues that face us, that we can take this plan, this vision, and make it a reality. And so I just wanted to thank everyone who did so much work here through the community board and through the stakeholders groups. And I look forward to being a productive part of Gowanus for many years to come, and being a viable way for, especially where Jonah ended, through the mentoring and through the training of new careers and getting to the younger community and showing them that there are viable paths to keeping yourself in the city by finding a trade or a skill and then growing it in Gowanus, whether you start in a smaller space, and Stephen Jumenta, who's a great participant in all that goes on in Gowanus, can tell you how a business in Gowanus that starts with an idea in a small space can grow to a huge facility. And we want to be able to provide that range for the upcoming entrepreneurs and the ideas that they bring to the community. So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to working with everyone further. Thank you, Ariel.
Thanks, Paul. Jesse Solomon from
Hi, everyone. Thank you for letting me ask a question. I want to say I echo Paul's comments of thanks to the team at DCP, but I do want the committee to know that, SPIDC and I know some of our member businesses, especially in Gowanus, are disappointed that we were not given any advance notice of this final report. And we have not had an opportunity to see any update on this work since October 2019, nor were we asked for permission to be included in the report in terms of our name being acknowledged. And while we appreciate that we were acknowledged, we would have really liked to see at minimum an opportunity to comment on the report before it was finalized. So given that, I hope that the committee will allow me and Ben, who's also on the line, to ask a few questions this evening. Given that the report was only released today, we haven't had the time to really pore over it, but thanks for the presentation. I think first and foremost, back when this vision was being developed, we were coordinating with other city agencies. And I'm curious, since October 2019, what work has been done on behalf of DCP to coordinate with the other city agencies to actually secure some of the commitments and investments that you outline as goals in this plan? And relatedly, has the administration actually made any commitments to what you've outlined in this plan? Are there capital dollars being earmarked for some of the infrastructure goals you have here? How are the recommendations actually going to be implemented? And that's just first of many questions. So just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, I think to your first comment. We definitely hear you. I think the way I would frame it is that this plan is meant to be a foundation for and a platform for future development and improvements within the IBZ. We want to, hear your thoughts and your comments, which are invaluable. At the same time, I just want to be clear too that we're under quite a bit of time pressure so we wanted to maintain that commitment to Community Board 6 to release a plan while Gowanus is in public review. During the pandemic, we put a lot of our work on hold, but we continued to flesh out the report. We have been coordinating with agencies. The pandemic really threw a wrench into the city's capital budget, as a general statement. So we've actually tried to do a lot of work to just maintain, that the DEP is committing to move forward with their improvements on 9th Street and 2nd Avenue that so I guess to answer your question about agency involvement, we have been more closely engaged with them over the past few months on this plan is meant to be a vision plan. It's not a set of commitments. And if the community board and in SBIDC and others feel strongly about certain aspects of it, I think that can be a tool to advocate for. But the purpose of the plan was more of a vision plan, and so but at the same time there are many facets of it, like DEP's work, which are hard commitments, and those are projects that are currently underway.
Has DCP made any, I hear you that it's a vision plan, but I'm curious if DCP has taken the recommendations from the stakeholders that you engaged, which were to ensure that conversations at minimum should be had to really make concrete investments in the IBC. Otherwise, a vision for recommendations is a little bit empty if there's not even an acknowledgement of what kind of funding is necessary to implement those recommendations, right? So that's one thing. I think there's still some clarification that we need in terms of how much buy-in the administration really has to some of the recommendations that you've outlined here. But I have a follow-up question on the zoning, and this is related to just the specifics of the plan in general. Are you at some point going to, are there any recommendations in the report actually about the different use groups and the different sections, the 4 different sections you presented in terms of uses? You mentioned job intensive uses, but what are those exactly? Other than industrial and manufacturing uses, it sounds like you have other things in mind. So I'm curious about that in terms of what sectors you're prioritizing. And then furthermore, what about concrete recommendations for additional FAR in certain sections, in some of those sections? If there are no concrete recommendations, then can you explain how the community is supposed to, once they see private applications for rezonings, how is the community and the community board supposed to really weigh in on those decisions if there aren't concrete recommendations from this plan about the additional FAR or what those uses should look like?
Sure, those are all great questions. I would start by saying that in the report, we have more details. So we do provide more examples and flesh out some of this. So this presentation was more of a high level or just highlights of our recommendations. The way we framed the uses was we tried to be inclusive of kind of growing uses like retail and office, but also the uses that characterize Gowanus, whether, not necessarily calling it Gowanus mix, but being more focused on the IBZ portion of the area. And so we generally group those together as arts, industrial, and production-based uses. And then within the types of industrial, we do get a bit more detailed about certain types of industrial that are growing. But overall, we want to ensure that there's enough flexibility to accommodate different uses, being mindful of how the market can shift, as it has been with the pandemic. The vision plan doesn't get into the level of detail as a rezoning proposal. So, we don't attach specific FARs. But I think, what's helpful is if you read the vision plan and, now that we have the Gowanus neighborhood plan, I think there's a lot to kind of cross-pollinate there. And so, as example, for North Brooklyn, we've proposing moderate density manufacturing districts between with 3, 4, and 5 FAR. So although the vision plan doesn't get into that specificity over specific FARs, I think we try to do it in a way that it still remains a vision plan, but also can reference other industrial areas and what we're proposing in the Gowanus neighborhood plan, if that makes sense.
So honestly, that wasn't completely clear to me, especially I hear you, there's no clear recommendations on FAR, but the first part of your answer, and this is just for clarity, so apologies to CB6, I know others have questions, but in terms of your recommendations for different types of uses, can you try to explain again what areas, and I know there's more details in the report, but that was only released today, so we haven't seen it. So what areas are you recommending for office use, and how do you treat office use in retail generally, given that this is an IBC and it's meant to be a vision plan for the industrial sector in the IBC, right? So, curious how, in our minds, one of the things we recommended was ancillary office use would be something that we were interested in, but standalone office would be something that we would be interested in seeing less of. So, that's very basic, but can you give that kind of plain language overview of how you treat office and retail in this IBC?
Sure. So one key way that we distinguish it was the area in the southern part of the neighborhood, the south of 12th Street. I think that's an area where we want to, as much as possible, support that ground floor, which for the most part is occupied by truck-intensive industrial uses, and so that's an area where we'd want to be more deliberate in promoting industrial uses, and that can be alongside arts uses. On the other hand, the area closer to the train and on the northern part of Gowanus, and let's say north of 12th Street or north of 9th Street, there are a lot of buildings that have a mix of office space uses with, let's say, artist studios or smaller maker industrial tenants. So we're generally supportive of that mix. We don't have we're not suggesting a specific tool necessarily to promote those uses, but we're considering it more of like a case-by-case basis where, like, let's say your proposal is developing close to or as part of an area that there is a cluster of artists and studio space. And so that's an area where we want to consider kind of a use mix that builds on that current fabric. That being said, we don't really know what the market will be in 5 or 10 years. We know there's a lot of the commercial market in particular can be really sensitive to fluctuations, as well as industrial market. So we do believe it's important to allow some flexibility. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it's a good one. We can also take that back as well.
Okay, last question, I promise, but
just-
curious. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Can we come back to it? I just feel
Sure.
badly because we do have a lot.
Sure.
But I want to hear it. Let's, Bob, Levine, you had,
Oh, Ariel, do you mind if I just chime? I didn't want
Sure.
to cut off Jesse. For people who maybe are more new to this process, I just want to go back to the generation of this. And I think, I think we should make sure that we're on the same page and there's nothing sort of wrong with understanding how we got here. And I think there is a tension here between what, a lot of people wanted to see in the Gowanus IBZ and what we were able to come up with, which was what we focused on in 2018 with negotiations with the council member and the community over what we could do. And there was a long, back and forth about including this area within the actual rezoning area, which we pushed back on, and we were and still are adamant that we could not handle taking on this area along with the rest of the work that we had already committed to studying, looking at an environmental impact statement, coming up with capital projects. And so we committed to coming up with a vision plan that could put forth a vision where not everybody agrees on everything, and to the level of detail that people can use it as a starting point for future conversations about change in the neighborhood, and particularly this area. And so there is a lack of specificity, and we acknowledge that on things that people want more specificity on. And I think that's going to be, things that people are, not satisfied with completely. But it's also not something that is static. It's not something that is just here it is and there's no more discussion about it. As we know, these documents are snapshots and they're good for being working documents and for people organizing around them, advocating for them, asking questions, and helping to move this forward. And so that's what we're excited about too, is this is the start of a long conversation around Gowanus, that we are going to be here for years, implementing the Gowanus neighborhood plan and looking at how the vision plan can help supplement and really help the neighborhood overall grow as we sort of have this collective vision of a more thriving and resilient, jobs oriented and affordable housing neighborhood. So I just wanted to put that in some context for people who may be new. So.
All right.
Bob.
All right. I had a question on one of the maps, the only map that showed the truck routes. It's a minor point, but it's important because the truck routes are only shown once in that whole presentation. And you have the little dots going up 9th Street, hitting 4th Avenue. And right there at that intersection, you've got a note of the F train or something there. And it looks like the only reason the dots stop because you have print area there, when in reality, it stops at 9th Street because it doesn't continue up past 4th Avenue. And it's not clear. I think people coming in and just looking at that are going to assume, oh, well, 9th Street just continues up, which is a major problem. And the slope is getting trucks off of 9th Street, getting into the brownstone areas.
Thanks for that comment, Bob. I'll take a close look at that. I know there's some issues with the color. I noticed the orange overlaps with the orange for.
It just, so what you, because the map ends right there, there's only a little bit and you have writing there. So it doesn't look like the truck route actually ends. It just looks like the map ends there. Thank you.
Mark, do you want to something to say?
Yeah, sure. First, to Jonathan, I've been around this for quite a while, so I do remember. I'm not really pleased with the amount of specificity presented tonight, and I haven't really read the whole plan. But I do appreciate you doing this. I'm thankful for what you're doing, and I want to start off by being polite to you guys before I say that I've been totally disappointed in the people who are going to be running for the city council in our area and their negativity and their inability to look into the future for the IBZ itself, which I assume most of them support. So while you cannot complete this process, during the current administration, as it seems clear that you can at this point, and I'm disappointed that you can't, that perhaps the new administration can pick up where you've left off and do actual rezoning for the IBZ, where the business in the IBZ can use the extra space afforded to them to expand businesses and increase what they do in an organic way that suits them rather than suits some planning like idea that you may already have. As you said, things are flexible. And I would like to see that kind of an increase in FAR in the IBZ zone that allows for such flexibility. And also, I'd like to see the city actually bear the costs of increasing that FAR rather than having individual rezonings at the cost of business owners and landowners that then create a different situation for what they have to do to be able to bear the costs that they've absorbed, and may increase the amount of FAR that they try to cheat on or use in various ways. So anyway, I thank you for what you have done, and I look forward to a new administration expanding on what you have done. Thank you.
Alan?
Thank you. Yeah, I just echo Mark that, ideally we would have rezoning rather than a series of private applications, for the same reason that, like the rule of law is better than special dispensation. It's certainly, that's a better way of running a railroad, but it's neither here nor there. My question is, so we have this tentative framework. Can you give us a sense of if there are milestones, temporal milestones, that you can foresee about when some meat would be added to the bones here? So that's one question. And the second question is a little bit more specific for the Third Avenue subgroup, or whatever you call it, sub-region. That seemed like the only region where you identified or alluded to the possibility for new residential growth. Is that correct? Is that the way you're looking at the study area?
Thanks, Alec. Yeah, so starting with your second question. Yes, that's correct. We only anticipated, I should say we only thought of growth along Third Avenue as far as residential. What we're calling the residential clusters in the side street, that's more of an effort to just bring those uses into conformance, not necessarily encourage growth, but just allow zoning to better match what's there today. And then Third Avenue is more of like a opportunity for maybe like a modest increase in growth of both residential and commercial. And then to your first question about adding meat to the bones, I'm hoping that as we're sharing the report itself, that will provide some more helpful details. And as Jonathan said, we view this really as a starting point. If you recall how we move forward with the Gowanus plan to the north, it was really like a step-by-step process, starting from bridging Gowanus and earlier work, and we took that and we developed a framework. So I think where we are currently is we're at a more vision plan level. It's an important foundation to move forward, and we of course welcome comments and feedback on how to flesh it out further, from the board or from businesses. Yeah,
I would add to that, Jonah, that I think, from an actual like calendar date, if what you're asking, I think, we're always happy for people to reach out and take this up and, to ask us questions, and we can try to loop in agencies. I would say realistically, given the Gowanus rezoning process, the enormous amount of bandwidth that's going on right now with that process, and also just end of the administration priorities that are going on. Post Gowanus is probably when that stuff can really kind of be brought up and taken on in a real intentional way. But yeah, there's no magic date per se. And I mean, we've been working closely with DOT and folks, and including them, in meetings like this. And, if people want to reach out and start talking about, the parking under the highway, et cetera, I think, the point of this is for people to start working on, right? I think just, we can be completely honest that like we are very focused on the ULERT process right now. And so the challenge of having those productive meetings, during that time is just a fact. But, I think this is the beginning of those types of meetings and work that people can start calling on us for.
Thank you. I'll just say, I am sure that I don't want to speak on behalf of all the stakeholders who've been thinking about this and doing more work on this than I will ever do. And they've forgotten more about this subject than I will ever know. But I bet that many of their concerns about the level of detail would be addressed by a commitment by the city about a juncture, right? At some point, at some date, whether that would be December of this year or spring of next year or whatever, or something like that, about when a more detailed plan could happen. They can say what they would say, but I suspect that some concerns about the level of detail would be addressed by sort of a rough roadmap for when we might see further progress.
And so I'm going to just, before I call on Jesse and Ben, I just want to say I was, looking forward to this, impressed by some of the development that had gone on, but then I have to say that chopping the IBZ up and sort of, I would be concerned about where some of those levels of details were headed. And I think, Paul's model for 21st urban manufacturing requires a real, much more, a bigger vision for this, for the whole IBZ that really does what you stated at the front. And I fear that the parceling it out and putting housing and residential development on a corridor that you've just already said is going to be a critical, truck corridor. I don't feel like it's been addressed with that level of robust, sort of mindset. But that's I just had to say that, and I'm going to hand it back over to, I guess, Ben and then Jesse.
And also, as I know there's more questions coming, but and part of this is I think due to the report or plan coming out this afternoon. So we obviously, as you guys read over some of those details, again, where the plan is at a higher level of focus, but there are details in there that you should actually read the plan. And continue to ask us questions, and we will be coming back, and we can continue to take those questions and clarify things in the coming weeks and months.
Ben?
Hi everybody, Ben Margolis, Executive Director of SBIDC. Just a quick question. We want everybody to be able to ask theirs. Is the city planning to provide any relocation assistance to industrial businesses that are displaced by either a salt lot tank eminent domain taking or the Gowanus neighborhood rezoning in general?
I would, sorry, I don't know. Jonathan, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that has not come up, and I can't speak for DEP, but in general for the broader Gowanus plan, that has not been something that has been discussed broadly.
And Nathan, are you done, Ben? Okay, Nathan.
People should, yeah, other folks should ask.
Okay, leave your hand up then. Go ahead, Nathan.
This is Richard Barak from the Brooklyn Borough President's Office using Nate's link. So a couple things on Jonathan's point, about city planning re-engaging. So I think a good next step for the committee and the community board at large, really take advantage of the opportunity to review the report and then use that to develop thoughts in terms of, you look at the boundaries that city planning set up. Do you agree with those boundaries? Would you want to shift those boundaries? And then within those boundaries, give thoughts to, are there uses you want to promote or restrict? Is there height? Is there a floor area proximate? Don't worry about what zones exist today, but to give a sense of feedback to help city planning with dialogue as this moves forward. Obviously, we'll probably have limited to what could be done evolving on city planning's initial report during the months of this administration, but I think getting a dialogue to be best positioned so you could try to make the case for city planning to be in position where it could move forward with an actual ULURP application. And I would even consider for the community board to even at a committee level, perhaps even doing a public hearing to help develop its thoughts to feed to the community board. And to city planning. And then the Gowanus rezoning, we're likely at Borough Hall going to set our public hearing on the week of June 28th. And it is quite appropriate to submit comments regarding this report to the borough president, because the borough president could always choose to go beyond the actual application and share thoughts based on this report. So community feedback would be great with that. And so I think as this moves forward and community board has a chance to give initial reports, then it could coordinate with city planning on future dates, obviously allowing city planning to juggle what it has to do with the workload on the Gowanus neighborhood plan. But I think there's able to get one or more meetings on the calendar year. And I think I sort of chat comment regarding the 10th Street under the Trax Park. So, that's certainly an issue to look forward to suggest comments in terms of type of design changes, pushing for capital budget opportunities. And finally, I want to say, we had a DOT ULURP, Community Board 6 may remember, for establishing a truck maintenance facility. And if you look at the borough president's recommendations regarding that property, we also talked about the sanitation trucks. So there's some ideas I think you may want, as a community, look at in terms of developing feedback from the report that you're going to start immersing yourselves in. Thank you.
Yeah, those are good points. Thank you, Richard. I would just note, we can take this offline, but the CB review now goes till July 2nd, just given the pause that the court had instituted. And I'd actually say that the DOT Fleet Services is actually a very interesting juxtaposition and a sort of a case study where, it was a DOT, it's a city project, and it came, through ULURP, and it was looked at by city council. But because we are doing this neighborhood plan, multiple city agencies are a part of this. And the vision that we have come up with together really helped us put additional, pressure to DOT, and also through that there was a DSNY component to those negotiations. And I think I had mentioned this in one of our meetings in the fall of just the sort of the part of the benefits of a neighborhood plan like this. Goes beyond what is just sort of the binary, process of one project or another. It's all these agencies have come together and they're more aligned in terms of what the community wants to see. And so when projects come up like that, and the community says we want to, have more of our parking not taken up by, trucks, and we want this and that. It's a lot easier for people to negotiate and for City Hall to help and other agencies to sort of respond since we've been doing this work. And so the vision plan help. We've been doing this for the Gowanus plan for a long time, but the vision plan for the IBZ will also help in a lot of these specific projects that may come up in a ad hoc way too. So.
Yeah, and just to add on that, the sanitation owns several of the lots they're on, right? So the city's in control, and with capital budget appropriations and appropriate zoning, there's certainly opportunities to try to direct. And then even with the city leases, there's ways to try to compel above and beyond improvements. Like the borough president always pushes urban agriculture, rooftops. We're now even pushing microgrids, battery microgrids. So these are the type of things using city leases and city capital that could go above and beyond standard zoning.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Ben, did you want to follow up? Hand still up. Are there?
Sorry. Just unmuting. Thanks again. Just wondering if we've contemplated any incentives to be available to landowners in the IBZ in order to meet regulations to limit stormwater overflow and flooding. It's one thing to talk about it at a high level, but if we're really contemplating growing the IBZ in a smart and responsible way, then there's going to be a need to spend money on flooding. And that industrial developments, even mixed-use developments, only give off a certain amount of revenue. So understanding a little bit, actually a lot more specifics around that would be really helpful.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I'll take that back. My next question was going to be for you, actually, if the incentives you were referring to are more of like zoning based or financial, like existing programs.
Financial, DEP.
Right. Okay, thanks.
We can also, we'll check with our DEP colleagues also about, the applicability of the forthcoming, unified stormwater rule, which I believe would be applicable here, which is an enormous help, particularly to stormwater capture and CSOs. But admittedly, I would need to, double check to make sure of its actual applicability here.
And I think like a kind of incentive, for example, residential wise, DEP back in the Giuliani era, pushing the low flow toilets, for when you had the old toilet, they gave you the bag to put in to displace water. So there may be a way of a DEP program that could help, again, with the cost to have these kind of equivalents on a unique scale based on an industrial water usage.
Thank you. Are there any last questions? Ready? So just in terms of the process here for this program, I was a little confused. Richard, I know you said that when the zoning comes to Borough Hall, then you referred back to this IBZ study as being part of what we might include. I would just reframe that process that you mentioned.
Yeah, so again, the clock we learned July 2nd. Again, we'll probably do the hearing the week of the 28th. So our hearing may be a couple days before our clock actually starts. But the board would have their recommendation made on the 23rd, I'm told. So our process would get us then 30 days, right? So that gets us to 1st of July, I'm sorry, August. So over those next several weeks beyond our hearing, again, getting feedback on anything related to this report would be most welcome to formulate the borough president's recommendations, because we do often put out ideas that are tangential, that they're not a direct comment on the ULURP itself, but it's putting out ideas. So a lot of the city planning commissioners, their terms are not expiring. They could be out part of the commission for many years going into the next administration. And so that's an opportunity for them to get somewhat more familiar with the city planning report today. I don't know if staff has intent to brief the commission on this report between now and say the end of the calendar year, but this can start helping the commissioners be more immersed in this issue as we move into a next administration.
So I have a question for my co-chairs, I guess, and for anybody else on the board. Then our recommendations on this particular, on this vision plan, I thought we would have to have, well formulated for our June 23rd vote, correct? But then we could continue to develop those ideas and send more ideas, keep it going all the way through the end. Is that the idea?
Yeah, I mean, just because the community board has an official submit date, it's not exactly precedent, but nothing says the community board can't be updating its information. So they feed what they feed to the borough president. If they want to keep fine tuning, they hear something great from the borough president, this report aspect itself over the next 30 days of the borough president before the commission has its hearing. This particular aspect of just focusing on the report, you're beyond the ULURP application. You could keep, again, sharing information because it's also feeding the city council when they have their hearing. So you really have roughly a 90 some odd day window after the board makes its recommendation on the 23rd to keep refining and informing, because whatever you could update the city council regarding the larger Gowanus plan and or this report is always helpful.
So since I think we still have some of our committee here, we do have one. We would have our next meeting on the 21st, which is just 2 days before 23rd. So as a committee, we may want to, between all of the elements of the rezoning neighborhood plan and this, perhaps have an interim meeting or at least circulate our notes and questions. I mean, that I think otherwise, we don't yet have a plan for formulating what our response at the WCDH committee is going to be. This is not a question this is an internal committee question.
Well, we need an opportunity, Ariel, to review the actual plan with the link, and then as a committee to be able to discuss that and formulate a response. And as Richard says, whether it's within the formal bounds of the ULURP or articulated in a way that the commissioners and the council member can factor it in. I think we need to start first reviewing the report, because clearly, the PowerPoint today really did not provide the level of detail that we're looking for.
That's true. I mean, I was sort of talking about both this and our resolution overall as well for the plan.
Gotcha.
Both. I think, but we had hoped to get something in regarding the vision plan as well into our, the commitments that we want to see happen. So both of them, I think we want that into our 23rd as well as along with our neighborhood. So it's just we could circulate emails, but I'm just wondering if we need a meeting before the 21st for this. After we've had a chance to, the DEIS and the neighborhood plan have been out there for a while, but this not, but all of it together.
And you should look at us as an opportunity to inform the council member-elect and the mayor-elect, right? One you'll know more likely in June, the other more likely in November. So, and the more in tune the mayor-elect is aware of this, the easier it is for city planning to make the case to move on to steps that go towards ULURP.
Ariel, this is Alec. I imagine that the IBZ part of the proposed of this whole picture would also be a subject of the recommendations that have come out of the land use committee meeting that follows the public hearing. And then, but that will probably be at a level of specificity that's not as in the weeds as we'd like to be, and that would require more reflection. So just something to consider. There's going to be a laundry list of recommendations with a yes or a no coming out of land use, and this would be a part of that, I think, too.
Yes. Sure enough. Okay, so we get it from all angles, but okay. Are there any other comments or questions for tonight? Right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentations and sticking around to answer a lot of good questions. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and we thank you for yeah, a lot of the good questions, and also being, you know, partners for the number of years that brought us here. And you let us know when and where you want us to come back and answer questions. And if your dates change or anything, you know, we'll be flexible and figure out how to make it work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Good night.